that I look and the way that, yeah, you know how I am.
You're you.
Got a box full of papers over here and stolen wolf whiskey that I gotta go through and do some stuff with, and stuff for if you have, there's boxes of papers for if you have ghosts over there. It's all a fucking nightmare.
Yeah, Justin's already starting shit too.
Hey, fuck Justin. You tell Justin that there are people that will hunt him down for saying Nickelback's a good band and you're trying to put that shit in my fucking mouth. Listen, Justin, I'm not even from Canada and I've got more pride than that, buddy. One time I brought up Nickelback to Justin. Justin's like, they have some okay song. No, they don't. Not a single one.
Fucking suck.
Oh my god. Oh. All right, I'm gonna quick check YouTube just to make sure you want to know what already. I look at this. I am notorious for YouTube not turning on the microphones. Okay. Oh, it must be experienced. Yeah, let me see. That must be out.
He was all over you for not being able to get on that link, and he ain't even ready over there on his side.
Oh no, I'm ready. I just have to make sure I do the checklists here.
If you were ready, we wouldn't be sitting there watching a blank desk, a bunch of mini bottles over there, stacked over there that you've had for 3 years that you never drink. I stopped sending you mini bottles.
No,
you never fucking drink them.
I drink the shit out of them. Look at what I am drinking a mini bottle. Look at that one. Look at that one. It's old.
Finally, he breaks up.
No, this is. Yeah, go ahead.
My problem with mini bottles is people would send me mini bottles too, and then later on they'd be like, "Hey, what'd you think of that such and such I sent you?" And I'd be like, "Oh, those were to actually analyze because I thought that those were for when my main bottle ran out and I needed it a little extra. Could I get another one of those? Because I for sure don't remember anything about what it tasted like."
That's right.
Well, when you got Nash doing it for you, just a little thing, he puts fucking labels on it. It's almost like getting the real bottle. I mean, and then on the Parker Heritage, I'll show you this. This is really even more fucked up. Okay.
I had too much time.
Oh my God. Look at this, Alan. He cut the fucking mountain kind of thing that they did on the original. It's cut. And then I look and it matches the goddamn pattern. I'm going, what is going on? And then you do see in the back that he has the same kind of thing going on, but he's got a bourbon blanket back there on the spare bed.
That's actually a shower curtain. I cut the top off.
You know what you do next time on those mini bottles, Martin? Now that Jeff has complained about
I'm
your
not complaining. Not complaining.
You wax dip every one of them from now on. Every one of them.
Oh hell yeah!
Yeah, but
usually I take that shrink wrap and I shrink wrap the shit out of it. And he's been complaining about that.
But wait, Alan, it's not the shrink wrap out of the shit. He changes the angles on it, so you only start unwrapping it, but you can't figure out where it starts.
I'll go this way, then I'll.
So you can.
Then I'll sidewind it.
Oh my God, it's so fucked up.
He gets done. He thinks he's been on a roller coaster ride.
Put your little dab of Gorilla Glue right there on the inside of that cap.
Oh, yeah, so bad.
There you go.
Hey, we've got Yol from Indonesia on. Good morning, Yol. Right? Pretty cool.
Very cool.
Yeah. All right. So I just want to make sure I did turn on the microphone.
See, I told you these groups where I've been sending them, sharing it to the overseas groups, Philippines, Indonesia, and all that. Beirut Whiskey Club. In my South Florida Scuba Divers Club. We'll get one or two of those in here every now and then.
I think that's me. I should make sure that there's damn.
I was flipping through here, just sharing it to groups, and all of a sudden, boop! Holy shit! I shared it to the South Florida Scuba Divers Club. Well, hell, next thing you know, we had a couple of watchers that, hey, Why'd
Yeah.
you share a whiskey group in here? Well, it's kind of by accident. Well, hell, I thought it was pretty cool. I said, okay.
Yeah, they're
include you
in
it
South
on
Florida.
the
They
next
gotta
one.
like whiskey too.
Yeah, so I've been sharing it to them each time we go on.
Yeah, well, they down in South Florida, you got to hit up Big Cypress. That's a great little distillery there, and if you're in Key West, go pick up some of the absinthe I designed for Jim Martin down at Key West Trading Company. So,
all right.
Yeah, I think it's going to be hard. I'm going to Florida tomorrow night. I'm leaving to start driving, but I'm going to be down there. But my mom and dad live in Boynton, which is, pretty far south. So I'm going to see if I can get a trip to the Keys. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to, because last time I went there and my dad was like, you guys did too much. I'm like, he drops that on me, and they're just, mellow. They think that if you set the air conditioning to 78 degrees, that's cool. They're cold, that kind of stuff that's going on down there. And I did prep it, so I might be able to get my mom to turn it to 76, and then she'll put like 5 blankets on her bed, but we'll have to see what happens. But I would like to get down. That's the only place that's the only place in Florida where I feel there's a distillery that has any kind of anything else except rum. I mean, if you're talking about going to a rum distillery, there's a bunch of them. But as far as trying to find a whiskey distillery in South Florida,
so yeah, it's hard to find. It's not a big market for brown spirits. That's the thing, and it's there's some great stuff down there. Red Horse Winery. It used to be winery. It's now distillery. They used to be in Ohio. Now they're down in Florida. But Joe does some great agave spirits. Some fantastic agave spirits. But yeah, for whiskey, it's not a lot of them down there.
Yeah, and then we went to a rum distillery, and I came back with a bunch of rum, and I still have a bunch of rum. I learned my lesson on that. Now, as far as maybe picking some bottles up that you're looking for, they got Total Wine down there. They got a couple liquor stores and side stuff that you can every once in a while get something unique. But like,
so the prices are ludicrous on everything too.
Yeah, it's not a control state, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Same thing with Georgia.
So we're the topic of maturation tonight. So I want to get detailed and specific and kind of try to understand, from your point of view. I know kind of you've expressed to me where you come from and how you use it, but I mean, realistically, aging whiskey has so many variables of how people can do it that some, there's certain ways of distilling where you absolutely need it. And then there, as you've said, if you distill properly on a pot still and you're pulling the right amount of heads and tails and you're distilling it properly, the necessity of barrel aging isn't as important as if you're doing it on a column still. I mean, it has different levels of importance of what you need to do.
Different levels of how you would treat the barrel, I would say, as much as anything. And there's always exceptions to that rule as well, for sure. And that's stuff that I'm still learning as well. Great example of that on the column stuff, and we can get into those details as we go and you ask questions. But I'll tell you this, man, whatever Eric Wolf is doing on that column still there in Lillits, Pennsylvania, he's doing it right. And his stuff is young, but it's gorgeous. His rye whiskeys are phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal.
Well, do you think also, as I always, to use a pretentious word, terroir, don't you think that Pennsylvania and rye whiskey, I just think the climate and the grains that they grow, right? That's like the sweet spot for rye. It always has been, right? As you went south, it was more bourbon, but yes, everybody can do rye everywhere. It doesn't matter where you are, you can do it. But how there's so much that goes into it, right? You got your yeast strains. I mean, don't the yeast strains change a little bit into colder temperature areas? I mean, you would think just like people, the further north you go, the fatter we are.
Yeah, I mean, those things all certainly come into play. But I'll give you another example though. The exact equal and opposite. Liberty Pole makes good bourbon there in Pennsylvania too. Eric can make good bourbon. The yeast strains do change, but that was also dependent on whether or not distillers are actually propagating their own yeast strains, which very few people do. And when it comes to Pennsylvania, of course, Michter's was the big name, and Michter's was using the Charles Everett Beam yeast strain, and then later after that, they were using Red Star baking yeast whenever Dick Stoll was there. So it is what it is. It's some of it is in the land, some of it's in the raw material, some of it is in the yeast, some of it's in the microorganisms. A lot of it's in the microorganisms that aren't yeast and the quote unquote contamination the industry is so scared of nowadays. And a lot of it's just in the magic of the hands of the distiller, the blender, and then the little bit of chance that's in the barrel. It all goes in and plays a part for sure.
Well, I mean, I agree that even if, let's just say, you've got something of lesser that didn't work out as good as you wanted it to, if you're a really good blender, there's a need for that type of whiskey in a whiskey that might, when you're blending different barrels, a bad barrel per se for a barrel pick, and maybe an off flavor can blend into it and not be so bad, right?
Certainly an off barrel. A bad barrel, no. You can cover up a bad barrel, but I firmly believe in the principle of alchemy that nothing great can come from anything bad, ever. It can't. For as great as it would have been if you left that barrel out, right? How much better would it have been if you left that barrel out, as opposed to economy dictating that barrel has to go in, and it takes a little bit away, right?
So there's good barrels that have not a lot of sweetness. I mean, there's when you talk to different whiskey drinkers, some love that absolute sugary where you're picking up the caramel strong, or you're picking up, and they absolutely love it. And then others, they don't want it. They want more like what you smell in a rick house, like whiskey and bourbon. They're not looking for peach or whatever, or something, like that in their whiskey. But then there's others that are. So, I mean, as a distiller, how do you, you know what I'm saying? How do you decide? I mean, does each one present itself?
I think maybe let's start here from the beginning with sort of my point of view regarding the way that I treat the barrels, right? Because then that'll inform people who are listening kind of where the conversation is headed, and where my brain is a little different than a lot of the other distillers. But I think that we've been in this unfortunate loop, which is part of being a craft distiller is, there were a lot of bad craft distillers that either got good or got out. And there are now a lot of craft distillers that have gotten in that had some home distilling experience, and they're really, really good at what they do. And they're very experimental, and they're making good product. But we're also up against this idea of what did whiskey, specifically bourbon, become after Prohibition, which is not at all what it was before Prohibition. It became very barrel centric, very commodity grain centric, focused very much on those very heavy vanillins, those very heavy caramel notes, to the extent that I think that people just automatically presume that bourbon always had that. And it didn't always have that. There was a wide diversity of bourbon prior to Prohibition, for sure, and certainly prior to industrialization, in the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s in particular. My take on maturation has always been, because I'm a pot still distiller, the way that I approach maturation is, so I don't use small barrels. 15 gallons make some great stuff. Steve Beam did some fantastic stuff in 15 gallons at Limestone Branch. Some of the best whiskeys I've ever had in my life. In fact, the best rye whiskey I ever had was from Limestone Branch in a 15-gallon barrel. But we at Spirits of French Lake have always focused on 53-gallon and larger. And the reason for that is because of the amount of surface area, the amount of oxidation that we get over time, and that the way that that barrel reacts to barometric pressure when a storm system comes in. You know, you guys are familiar with the idea in the springtime that ponds flip over, the liquid in the barrel flips every time a storm comes through, and you need that surface area, right? We're not so much looking for straight up extraction from the barrel. We're not looking for those real heavy caramels, those real heavy vanillas. I can get that stuff from fermentation with the ingredients I use and the yeast strains that I use and the cooking temperatures I use, the double pot still distillation, etc. The other thing that I was always very interested in as a craft distiller is staying away from the barrel driving everything, right? You go with a 3 or 4 char barrel and you go to a hot rick house, the barrel is going to drive the majority of the flavor. Kentucky distillers will tell you that. They'll say 60-70% of their flavor coming from that barrel. For me, it didn't make any sense for 2 reasons. One's a market reason. The market reason is that I'm in the backyard of bourbon, and even though Southern Indiana was making bourbon at the same time Kentucky was, before it was ever even a named product in the 1820s, why would I want to create something just like what they make on the other side of the river, right? Then what compulsion does anyone have to cross that river to come to Southern Indiana and come visit me? They have none whatsoever if I don't make something different. And yes, I'm not going to get, quote unquote, the bourbon bros, as it were, interested until I can prove that I'm legitimate, which I feel like I've done a decent job of doing. Maybe not for everybody, and that's fine. I'm not for everybody, and I get that at this point. That's okay. But the goal has always been to make something a little different and to approach it much more like a brandy distiller, or much more specifically like a traditional distiller in the Black Forest of Southern Indiana would have done prior to Prohibition, which is the idea, again, the grain has terroir, you know, and this balance, a blend and balance of 50-50. 50% raw material combined with fermentation, combined with distillation, and then 50% maturation, so that everything balances. And so that no matter how old a whiskey of mine might get, you're always going to taste whatever those positive grain attributes are. So my approach to maturation is much different than a lot of other distillers would be. So, and because I'm doing pot still, as you mentioned, I have a lot of control over the cuts that I'm making now. I've come off the column still thing a little bit. I understand their rationale. I understand why they do what they do the way they do. They tend to typically, not always, there are examples otherwise. Stumpy Spirits is a great example. I think the Peerless guys have done some great stuff. Eric is a great example as well. Typically, column stills are sort of a process of industrialized, mechanized agricultural commodity endeavors. And so they are running fast, they're running quick, they're getting a lot of throughput. They're not getting the body of the spirit that a pot still typically does, although there are exceptions to that. And a lot of them are making cuts the way a pot still distiller does. So when I choose my barrels, what I have to look for is I don't need char. I don't need heavy char, right? I don't need a 3. I don't need a 4. I don't need to, use terms like alligator char, because that char is really working as a filtration device. It's not really adding any flavor. It's adding very little flavor other than some lignins that break down a little bit more than what they would in a lighter charred barrel. But what it's doing is it's pulling out stuff that you don't want in the whiskey over those years.
Subtracting.
What I'm after, exactly. What I'm after is trying to hold on to as much of that volatility as I can and focus more on esterification. And then the extractive principle that I want out of the barrel is much more focused on some alternative flavors you can pull, such as hazelnut, coconut. Sometimes, and my whiskey already has this flavor to it anyways, but some sort of a horehound candy characteristics that the barrel can really amplify. And so that's what's always driven me is number 2 char, medium plus toast. For me, the important part is that toast underneath that char, right? In fact, if it didn't take longer to get the esterification process that I wanted because the wood is a little thicker by not being charred, and if the barrel didn't have to be charred to be called bourbon, I probably wouldn't char the barrels.
You would
I'd
just
probably
toast
medium
them.
toast everything. Or, God forbid, and I know there are people out there that are going to flip their lid, I go back to the old way of doing things, and I probably wouldn't even use a new American oak barrel. I'd probably use a used barrel, because I love used barrels. I love used barrels more than I love new barrels.
All right. So we're going to get the actual podcast started now so that the people that are going to be listening.
Well, hell, I told all that shit and it wasn't even on the podcast, Jeff. What the hell?
Just remember, you're the circus monkey. I still love that. I love that video. I just post it like over and over just so I can watch it on the top of my feed. You just
what the fuck am I, a circus monkey?
yeah. It's just so awesome. You say it, so it just reminds me. It's depiction of you. No, you don't have to go over it. That was the plus for everybody on YouTube Live and whatnot.
Awesome.
So I just I don't want to give out any more, but you were getting into the used barrel, and that's a whole different thing because there's a lot of people. A lot of people starting to do that mainstream, not just as a finishing element, but I mean, as a distilling element into the used and then finishing with new barrels. I mean, there's so many different things you can do. So let me get it started for recording right now. So everybody on Facebook and YouTube, Alan Bishop is here. He is one of our main sponsors, whether it's through the Spirit of French Lick, the master distiller there, or through his One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute, or if you have ghosts, you have everything. You got to check those channels out. You're killing it with them. I mean, listening to this season of If You Have Ghosts, you've gotten better. I mean, your how you question what when you have a guest on. It's just it wasn't bad before, but now it feels like someday I'm going to hear on iHeartRadio, on the radio, it's going to be you talking about how you talk about ghosts and spirits. You know what I mean? Up there with, Curb Your Enthusiasm podcast, or with, what's his name? Will Ferrell's podcast with, for Scotch. I think you could do it. It just keeps getting better, man. Anyways, I gave a great plug for that. So we're going to do the 30-second plug real quick once I get this started, and then we'll do the theme song with Kenny Fuller, and we'll get it going. All right?
That's good.
Here we go.
Right.
Drinking bourbon, sipping on some scotch. We get a little wild, but it's sure fun to watch. We love what we do, we're drinking every brew. Man, we talk some shit, but we're telling the truth. Yeah, we're the Scotchy bourbon boys, raising some hell and making some noise. Yeah, we're the Scotchy bourbon boys. We're here to have fun and we go to enjoy. We're here to have fun. Yeah.
Woo! All right.
Hi.
Welcome back to another podcast of the Scotchy Bourbon Boys.
Yeah.
It's going to get wild here tonight. We have Alan Bishop. I think you're the two of the
Alchemist.
we got
In the
the
house.
alchemist, but you're now at you and Greg Schneider are like back and forth, but you just went one up on Greg, and Greg's in the comments tonight, so he's leaving some comments, and we're going to be talking maturation, and we've been talking a little bit up front, and Alan, I mean, and it's funny because you were talking a little bit about the column still and how you used to be a little bit harsher on the column still to pot still, and you've kind of like the more you went down that road as far as finding there's ways of running a column still that are, are, what would you say, more than acceptable. It's just not mass production. I mean, when you were just saying, what they've done at Beam, when you're in the Beam main column still, it's coming out like a fire hydrant, gallons and gallons a minute. And it's just about production, right? And you're talking about aging and everything and using that barrel. But then they put in a craft distillery. It still has a smaller column still, but it's not coming out the same. And you can try different things because, when you're making hundreds of gallons a minute, you don't really have a leeway. You're producing so much distillate. It better be what you're trying to produce. Because if you screw that up or you're experimenting on that, it's a whole different story. So now that they have the other distillery, that gives Freddie a little bit of leeway that he's not having to produce hundreds of gallons a minute. He's just on a smaller column still. But anyways, we're the Scotchy Bourbon Boys. www.scotchybourbonboys.com. Check us out for all Scotchy Bourbon Boys things, t-shirts, Glencairns, and then also Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and X. Check us out there and all the major podcast formats. I did that really quick because I can't wait to get back to this subject.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So you were
subject of maturation tonight.
Now, when the way you do it, you were talking about how you do it. The whole thing of the spirit of French lick is respect the grain. And that's kind of how you do it. Now, you really, in a really quick review, you talked about that you wanted to do it that way, the way that they were doing it in Indiana pre-prohibition, and have respect the grain, pull the grains out, because one, marketing, does it make sense to try and compete with people who are making 95% of when we first started the boom, we're making 95% of the bourbon in the country was being made in Kentucky, and the same way, pretty much the same way. Why? And when we first got together, that first podcast, I said, you're trying to make an Indiana, profile. And that's kind of what you've done. And it's different ways of making bourbon, but there's so many different ways to mature. Would you agree there's not a right or a wrong way? I mean, it's just a way. I mean,
and let me kind of ask this too, that when you're a big conglomerate company that's pumping out hundreds of gallons a minute, out of a column still, you're really not getting that much flavor from the grain. And that's where they're pretty much relying on the barrel to pull those flavors out, right?
Yeah, at least the heavier flavors, definitely, for sure. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a number of things to address there rather quickly. So, yeah, I have. So I'll clarify. I have backed off on the column thing a little bit, but overall, not on the low rec Kentucky column. Still, I should say that. Yeah. It has its place. It's all about intention and discernment. For me, as an alchemist, I have to always speak truthfully about those sort of things because I consider myself in that light. So would I say that there is a right way? I think it depends on what the intent is and the discernment is, right? So for me, I have no vested interest in commodity market sort of stuff. So I'm always going to look at that stuff as what it is, and it has its place too. And I'll play in that field, not as a distiller, but as something else at some point in time in the very near future, with the Shriner brand, with doing blending and non-distiller producing and all that stuff. That's a possibility. It could happen. But I certainly think that for me, the right way for me is double pot still, or guys that have modified columns, right? Adam Stump, a great example. Eric Wolf, a great example of what can be done with a column with some modifications. But I would also say the modifications that they have sort of don't make it any longer a low rec column still. So, and with maturation, a right or a wrong, absolutely, there's just different ways, exactly, depending on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to make a more of a commodity spirit that is known by the name Kentucky style bourbon, then certainly there's a category that falls into with post-prohibition sort of things. And then if you're trying to do something that's a little bit more bespoke, then there would be the way that they do it would probably be the wrong way for trying to do something a little more bespoke, I guess is the way I would phrase it. That was a lot of information in a short
amount of time. Yeah. So let's start from the beginning, like the original distillers. So even like the moonshiners of today, which are you can take it if you're in the backwoods, you can do certain, you set up a still and you're shining back there. And there's some, as you said, there's a lot of good home distillers. If you're making the right amount, under the right amount, then you're not really doing it. There's a certain amount of leeway for that to happen in the United States, but it's state to state that determines that. I know that, right? That law.
Missouri is the only exception that I know of.
Okay. So what I'm saying is, I was thinking about it today because we're talking about maturation. One, back in you're talking the 1800s when they first were doing it, you got this still, right? And if you're gonna produce any amount, I just even to run the still in one day, there's a lot of work that goes into it, because what are you distilling into? It's not like when you watch any kind of, any show or whatever, they've got or go into some distilleries with they've got the plastic, 360 gallon containers sitting there. They've got buckets. They've got, but back then it wasn't easy to have a bucket and then to make a copper still. And you've been doing that. You've done the same thing. Was anybody who made their own still, and where do you get the copper? You'd have to buy sheets from go in a little detail about, did you have to, mallet out and flatten out your own copper that you dug out of the ground? How was that, you've probably really, what would you say? You've had this part in your head to explain it, right?
Well, the earliest stills in the U.S., were typically imported into the United States, and later on, Philadelphia and also Baltimore became kind of centers for copper work on the East Coast. So the guys really weren't building their own stills unless they were just also copper workers at the time, because copper was expensive, and also there was no real annealed copper at that time, so there was no soft copper. So you're dealing with some stuff you really gotta anneal yourself and beat the hell out of to get anything out of, and you gotta have some real specialized skills to get it. Now, a little later on, when you get over towards my area, and actually there in Ohio, then you get into some copper workers that came in that were what we now call the Roma, which we used to call the gypsies. Specifically the Stanley gypsies that were over in Dayton, Ohio. They were responsible for the vast majority of stills throughout the Ohio Valley, all the way down to St. Louis, all throughout the 1800s. And so that's where that stuff came from. And as far as their fermentation vessels, the vast majority of those were 120 gallon hogshead barrels, because a lot of the old, there were no real set recipes. Sometimes the guys would write down, if they could write, they would write down, use a bushel of this, a bushel of that, a bushel of this. So those are big enough to hold, 3 bushels of grain to a vessel. So it made sense for them to use. But I think that actually answers part of your question too, as far as maturation and how it became a thing in the United States, and not so much to put a finger on like when was the first charred oak barrel used or anything like that. But you have to remember that about the time that distillation started in the United States was also very shortly after distillation was no longer sort of a hidden art that was practiced by the mystery schools and the monks and the religious orders and things like that, and had gotten out a little bit more to the general public, although they didn't always necessarily know what they were doing. And so that led to a profusion of very bad distillers. Even early on in American history, it didn't take long to figure out that, maybe we can make this taste a little bit better if we filter the shit out of it and throw it into a barrel of some kind, right? That'll fix the problem. So whereas a distiller who's really passionate about their art and really understands their art, if they're going to make a white spirit, they're going to cut it incredibly clean. They're going to make a beautiful, elegant white spirit. If they're going to go into a barrel, they're going to leave a little grit to it, because you need a little grit there so that the barrel just doesn't eat everything.
Okay. So initially, the barrels that they were using, they weren't charring them. right? I mean, the whiskey would just go into a barrel that wasn't, it was just a regular barrel, correct?
I actually, this is where I where I don't agree with a lot of the historians out there. I have yet to see any evidence that that was the case. They were almost always they were always toasted. They had to be to bend the staves, and B, the charring thing. Everybody tries to put their finger on a moment where that happened. I suspect that that's been going on a whole lot longer, and one of the reasons, one of the rationales for that is they certainly knew about charring barrels, because to make water safe on a seagoing trip, they would fill charred barrels with water at that time. So they certainly knew about the effects of char for filtration. That's one of the mistakes that we make looking forward to backwards with history is thinking that somehow we're smarter than what they were. And it's not true. Our technology's better than what they had a lot of times, but we're not smarter than they were. So
sometimes we're a lot dumber.
1,000,000%.
Yeah.
1,000,000%.
I mean, yeah, the charcoal filtering, they were sending over water in charred barrels because it would filter the water as you were on your trip. So that would keep the water clean, and you would the supply. So then it would make sense once you were here using the barrels. If you stored whiskey in them, they'd be charred, right? I mean, it would
absolutely. And not to interrupt there, Jim, but I'll throw this in there too, because it's something that people never think about. You never hear in the industry, and I keep using the word alchemist, and I'll use the word hermeticism and all that stuff. People do not make if they're studying the history of whiskey, like they're always specified of like, I'm into this particular geographical region at this particular time, blah blah blah. Nobody really puts that whole story together of this emerging out of the art of alchemy. And one of the main things in the art of alchemy is filtration. Filtration is one of the most important steps in the art of alchemy, all the way down to charcoal filtration, right? They knew about that stuff in ancient Egypt for sure. Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, it evolved naturally from out of that art. It all came from there. If you were going to assign every century of distillation history a number between, let's say 1 and 6, for example, those alchemists are year 0. Everything descends from 0, right? It all comes from there. It all came from somewhere. It all came from some realm of ideas that is magically turned into pixie dust that the marketing teams for everybody jumps on and turns into a story. So,
I mean,
I kind of wonder too that, back in the early days that not all these barrels were used for storing liquids. I mean, some of these barrels, were stored with flour and sugars and other stuff like that. And you gotta think that maybe, some of these guys, way out somewhere, they had to maybe take, one of those empty barrels and fill it with whiskey at one time, even if it wasn't charred.
Yeah. Well, and barrels, think about what a barrel was at that time too. So
But it had to be toasted a little bit to bend the staves and all to make that barrel. So
yeah, and it's easy to go too far with that and make char on accident. And think about this as well. So I don't jump onto like the fish barrel theory and all that stuff. I have a very hard time. It probably happened at some point, but it didn't make the whiskey better. We can all, I think, agree to that.
Not
so
fish
nobody's
or
like,
pickle or fish or nails. I don't know how a barrel of nails, and then you char it and then you put that in there and you're putting on. I don't think that's gonna. Now,
but you got to figure too that so way back then they were basically relying on the grains and everything at first to to come out with their distillation, what that white whiskey was tasting like.
Well, exactly. And you're relying on 2 different kinds of barrels there too, if you think about this. So, and I'll drive to this point, and then this will touch on the herring barrel and the Bittnells and all that stuff. You have dry coop and wet coop barrels, 2 different things, right? And every town has at least a cooper. But what is a barrel? If you think about it, what is our current modern equivalent of a barrel? And I thank Brian Cushing from the Victorian Bar Room for pointing this out to me, because I didn't think of it like this until he mentioned it to me. The current version of a barrel right now is a cardboard box, except the barrel doesn't have to be disposed after 1 or 2 uses. right?
Can be used.
Those barrels roll into town. They have whatever they have in them. And yes, maybe you would reuse them, but it probably, if they came with pickles in them, you're probably going to put pickles back in the fucking things. Or if they're falling apart, the cooper is going to take what he can use from those various barrels, rework them, plane them down, put together a new barrel. So sometimes, probably, yes, occasionally, a stave or two from something goofy probably ended up in a barrel, right? Because it was just the nature of it. But I certainly suspect that if I were a distiller even back then and you sent me a damn herring barrel and I smelled that thing before I put something in, I'll be like, you know what? You can kiss my ass.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah, but I'm sure there's a fucked up distiller that took it as a challenge. It's just,
Well, I'm
it takes
sure.
all types,
Oh, yeah.
right? But I agree
Yeah.
with you. I agree right there. So as we approach, you approach prohibition, obviously, we were able, the production and the amount of barrels. But I mean, initially, the one thing that's for sure, when whatever it was, when you took that barrel and you stuck it on the water and you sent it down to New Orleans and they had Bourbon Street, I really think that's a major part of the story that was probably legit, because it's on the river, it's sloshing around, and it takes what, 6, 7, how long does it take to go down the Mississippi from Kentucky at that time? It takes a certain amount of time. So now you're putting a little bit of age in it and you're sloshing it around. So you're, it's going to get more surface contact, and it's going south. So the heat obviously on the water is pretty intense too. So you're doing a lot of aging things. And that's why when it was hitting New Orleans and they were tasting it, it was probably on a better level than just sitting there aging for the same amount of time. And usually they only wanted to keep it for that season, right? Wasn't that you made enough to last yourself so you could sell till you could start growing more grains? And then they weren't just initially leaving barrels around with no whiskey without drinking it or selling it, because you wouldn't want to do that, because the whole reason you did it was to make money off of the corn you couldn't sell, right?
Yeah, and that was part of the some of the bigger mythology that I see out there too. Is, yeah, of course there were bad distillers like I mentioned, but the ones that stayed in business in those early days, let's say up to the 1820s, 30s, 40s, once you really start to see a little industrialization start to really creep in, they were probably, you always hear, oh, they were probably making bad whiskey. No, they were probably making really good white whiskey, truthfully. And what they often were doing, they would get a little age on them, and sometimes they had excess, they would hold it over for a year or something like that, whatever they needed to sell locally. But typically what they were doing is they're distilling in the fall. So they're distilling, as soon as the crop comes in September and October, it's getting distilled in November, December, January. It's going in the barrels, setting out in the yard or in some kind of shed somewhere until April when the spring floods come in. Then they do ship downriver. But the other thing that happens is, so you always hear New Orleans, which is an important part of the story, but there's ports on the way down as well. A lot of times the flatboats didn't make it more than 3 or 4 cities down before they sold everything they had, never got to New Orleans. But otherwise, once it got to New Orleans as well, they were actually shipping around Florida and up the East Coast with whiskeys as well. So now you've got more aging time. You got more of that Jefferson's Oceans marketing thing going on. And you are getting some reaction out of the barrel. 100,000%. I'm not sure, and since we're focused on maturation, I'm not sure at what point, like with the char, not only being able to put a finger on, like, okay, who's the person who came up with the char and all that stuff, and certainly, again, as Barton kind of mentioned, I'm sure there were mistakes with toasting, even with French barrels in cognac, right? There were certainly probably some light char barrels in cognac here and there, even if on accident. I'm not sure when it becomes like, hey, we need to really hit this barrel with like as hardcore of a char as what we possibly can. At like what point in the lexicon that becomes part of the conversation, and that flavor that people now identify with post-prohibition Kentucky bourbon, when that comes into more vogue. I'm not sure when that really happens, but certainly it seems to me that up until the low rec column still came in, people expected, if they got a bourbon and that distiller said it all that rye was in there, they wanted to be able to taste that rye. If you got a bourbon and that had wheat in it, they wanted to be able to taste that wheat. If you got a rye whiskey, it better damn taste like rye. It better not just be straight up barrel, right? People people had different tastes at that time, and I think people still have those tastes. They just don't realize they do because they've not been marketed to in that way, you know.
Right. Plus the rules of what of how it the market, first there was the rules they had to put in place, bottled and bond, everything, because of the fact that you had to get the confidence of the consumer, because that confidence was waning based off of what people were doing, the rectifiers were doing. Everybody, it was just like once you, as a distiller, once it left your place, 40 different things could happen to it. You're shipping it in a barrel. I mean, they can add to it. They can, that people can skim off the top. I mean, there's so much that can happen. But then nowadays, the rules are there and they want to do them. But the market itself governs itself also. You know what I mean? The size and the bourbon. If you're going to, you can't, we've already proven in the late 60s, early 70s, if you start producing shitty whiskey, there's always vodka, tequila, everything waiting in the wings to basically screw you over. You know what I mean? And
or if you produce too much whiskey, in general, it's waiting.
So. Now before, though, when you produce too much whiskey, we had a problem in the fact that people weren't accepting the age like they do now. Right now, I think they've marketed it that a 23-year-old whiskey can be, people want to obtain it. Now, a 23-year-old bourbon, as we know, isn't anything like a Scotch, because one, Scotch is pretty much aged mostly in used barrels, and that allows you to age longer. There's no doubt about it. You put it in a used barrel, you're just not going to get the flavor. Flavor's been extracted from it, right? So there you go. So now we're getting into all the different stuff. And it's, to me, why I wanted to do the maturation is because you, as a pot distiller, and how you're doing it, respecting the grain, and producing an Indiana or a pot still profile, bringing out those flavors and everything. That's one way to do it. But there's, like, for instance, I wanted to get into MGP. Okay, so you've got some really good blenders pulling barrels from MGP. You know what I'm saying? They're out there. I'm not going to name any brand or whatever. And then once they get it, it's kind of like what you do with it when you get it is like this playground that most people hadn't been doing, but now all of a sudden you're starting to see it. I mean, for instance, we were talking with Buzzard's Roosts, and he basically he bought barrels that the bourbon was put into a used barrel and aged 6-7 years. And then and then he said he took it and he put it into a brand new French oak barrel that he had, and he put it in there for 8-9 months, and then he sold that. But then he's got an American whiskey that he then put the distillate that he's distilling through, I believe, contract distilling, into that partially used barrel. Not one that's had whiskey in it for 6 or 7 years, but it's only been in there 8-9 months, 1.2 years or whatever. And that's what he's starting with. And then he's got that in there for 4 or 5 years. So there's so much you can do. So how do you, as a distiller yourself, isolate with so many things that you can do? I mean, it's wide open right now, right?
It is, and to be fair, there's been other times that it has been too. So one of the things that we are actually seeing is well, twofold. So I mentioned overproduction that has happened before, prior to Prohibition as well. In fact, that's one of the reasons, other than Southern Indiana, which is the style of stuff I make, the Black Forest region. That's one of the reasons why they focused on brandy so much, because they were less at the market forces of overproduction. Because some years you have no brandy, right? So they could focus on that, but more so. The entire business model of Seagram's and Shenley, ironically related to MGP here, their entire business model was blended whiskeys. And Canada, for a long time, instead of using neutral grain, They were using 100% component whiskeys aged in different types of barrels and making blends. So this is all coming back around. And so what you're talking about is barrel management, liquid innovation, that sort of thing. For me, at Spirits of French Lick, and bear in mind, I've said this before in the past. When I started there, nobody gave me any rules. I wrote a whole bunch of rules for myself is what I did.
Yeah.
And what happened by doing that, to be quite honest with anyone out there, was I was very idealistic and I painted myself into a fucking corner. It's what has happened.
Oh, wow.
Which is fine because I have about 1,000,000,001 ideas that I will express in time and get out there to the public. But the way that I would tend to approach certain things is, we always focus on, I said this before the show started, but 53-gallon and larger barrels. Nothing wrong with small barrels, little 15s. Had some great stuff out of them. Gary Heingardner out at Woodhat does some great stuff. Steve Beam was doing some great stuff at Limestone Branch, but I always wanted to go 53 because I felt like it made you a little bit more, at that time, it made you a little bit more legitimate in people's eyes if you're filling 53s, right? Like, oh, you're a real distiller. Even if you're only making 3 or 4 a day, you're a real distiller at that point. So the way that I sort of decide on things is, obviously, if I'm making a bourbon, it has to go into a new oak barrel, but I'm going to approach that a little differently because that pot still not needing heavy filtration from charcoal because I'm making tight cuts on the pot still. I'm going to focus more on toast. I always want air-dried staves. I hate kiln staves. I don't think kiln staves taste right. They never have to me. And I'm going to focus as much as I can on that oxidization and in 2 different climates for maturation because that's going to affect the barrels quite a bit differently. Either a warehouse that goes as hot as it gets in the summer and as cold as it gets in the winter, or a warehouse much more like a brandy cellar with very high humidity, very high angel share, that sort of thing. When it comes to finishing, and again, being an idealist, right, at the time, looking at a finishing barrel, which I love some of the finishes that are out there, but for me, I've always kind of thought of it like this. And Scotch is a good example. Everybody knows the sherry butt in Scotch whiskey. They were using the sherry butt because that's what they could get at the time, and it just turned out that it tasted good. But I do think from everything I've read, they preferred those barrels to be dry. If they had their druthers at that time, they wouldn't have used a sherry cask or a sherry butt. They would have used something that they could have gotten themselves that wasn't a used barrel, used cardboard box as it were, right? We talked about that analogy, but they used what they had. So for me, when I look at finishing at Spirits of French Lick and I think about the motto, respect the grain, and the fact that we never add anything post-distillation other than water, and that we don't make any liqueurs or any cordials or anything like that, I have always wanted any finishing barrel I had to be a dry barrel, and that it's only going to get the influence of what's soaked into those staves. Because if you get a barrel that was a port barrel, and listen, there's half-gallon port rolling around there, what is the difference in that and me just pouring a half-gallon of port into my bourbon barrel? And that's fine,
right?
As long as you're honest.
Tell people that's what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm all for that as long as they're honest, right? But the minute that you do that and you're not honest, and let's face it, there have been some people out there like that, they're going to eat your ass alive. Whether or not you make good product or not, it doesn't matter. People get very, very particular about those TTB categories, like real particular about those TTB categories. Maybe a little too precocious in some ways. So my methods have always been a little different. The other thing that we do that's maybe a little different, and this is cool too, I think, is that we typically don't bring in, we have in the past, but we typically don't bring in finishing barrels from outside because we have so many different products, right? So, I did a New American Oak absinthe. I kicked the absinthe out and threw rye in it because why the hell would you not throw rye in an absinthe barrel? It's ready to drink Sazerac. I've done a lot of that stuff with the wine barrels from the other side and things of that nature as well. But I do like what the non-distiller producers are doing. And again, they're really, even with the innovations they're doing, and some of the things are very, very new, very, very cutting edge for what we imagine whiskey or American whiskey, bourbon whiskey, rye whiskey to be, it's still somewhat paying tribute to the past through that Seagram Shinley sort of thing. I will say this. Having worked at Copper and Kings for 2 years and juggled a bunch of fucking finishing barrels with beer barrels, more power to anyone who wants to do that on any regular basis, because I hated just the liquid management aspect of that, of pulling everything down, putting it in the blends, putting it back in the barrels, pull it out of this barrel, put it in that barrel, track this, track that, track that, track that. Did you just, wow. I'm good.
You have to be an organized person to be able, or it's big enough that you got a spreadsheet or whatever. But yeah, or you have
also,
wait.
To be fair, too, I didn't get Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
You actually could do it. You just have to have the right person tracking it for you. We know someone who tracks shit like that.
Oh yeah, there's people that do for sure.
Yeah.
I was going to say though too, my perspective again is a little different because I did grow up in a moonshining family. So for me, I was skewed. I never was a bourbon guy. Never have really been a bourbon guy. I'm still not a bourbon guy. In fact, if anything, I like bourbon less now than I did when I started in this industry, to be truthful with you. But that's also because I'm bored with it. So my fascination was always on fermentation, ingredients, distillation. And then the barrel was sort of like, oh, yeah, well, I guess people expect this stuff to be brown and have a certain flavor to it.
So Ed Blay was on talking about what he did. And the one thing that he said that you're just saying is he's like, I don't care who you are. It's like bourbon has a starting point and an end point. People who drink bourbon start off and they don't know and they experience and they taste. He goes, and there's not a lot of people that just keep going once they reach a point. There's a point where you've tasted it. You know, you've had the Pappy that you wanted to taste, and you've had all the craft distilleries, and you've had all of it. And it's kind of like it runs its course. And I was just like, that's something that I hadn't thought of. He's like, it's not going to run its course with you because you just keep you have access to so much more, and it keeps you from being bored. But the average person, once, you know, anybody can say when you walked in the store the first time before you ever were drinking bourbon, you would walk in and you'd see a couple that you knew from Knob Creek or Jim Beam, but all the other ones were kind of like looking at something you didn't understand, and then you started to understand them, and now when you walk in, you see them all and you're bored. It's like, is there something there that I could pull out of there? But you know that the stuff that everybody's trying to get that's not there, that you're bored with already because you've gotten it. You know what I mean? But then you also know that there's some really good stuff on the shelf. You've had it. You probably drank 2 or 3 bottles of it. But the people who are trying to get the stuff they can't have, you're like, well, that's way better.
Know what drives me crazy? This is a maturation related thing with bourbon. The thing that really drives me crazy at this point, and haven't had a little more time to analyze the things that really bother me, as opposed to, it used to be column still distillation and all that stuff. The thing that really bothers me is that bourbon was always intended to be a blue collar drink. It should always be a blue collar drink, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a working man's drink. It's for people who go out and bust their fucking knuckles for 40 hours a week, right? Yeah. That's what it should be for. It had gotten very, very pretentious, and now that's kind of turned into a, sitting around smelling your own farts joke, right? Like as South Park did with wine. But the thing that really drives me crazy is bourbon is ostensibly nothing more than a corn whiskey with some secondary grains. And yet the corn in bourbon, by bourbon aficionados particularly, and also by the industry as a whole, sort of gets treated like Rodney Dangerfield. It gets no respect, right? Because they don't want their corn whiskey to taste like fucking corn whiskey, right? And there's always this like, well, the craft distillers are playing around, even good craft distillers. The craft distillers are playing around with this weird color corn, whatever. But I tasted it, and well, shit, it doesn't taste like all the big commodity bourbons made out of yellow number 2 corn. Isn't that the point? Isn't that entirely the point of this?
Yep. That's so you don't get so bored out your mind. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I'm not saying, I still love that head turning moment when someone gives you something and you taste it and you're like, holy shit, that worked. You know what I mean? And and that's there for almost all bourbons. There's stuff that works. You know what I mean? But I would say like at a larger distillery, the stuff that really works well, just they almost have nothing to do with it. You know what I mean? They're trying for a taste profile that consistency. They get it, and that's one of the hard things to do, but they get it on a consistent basis, and it's 90% of that working class. Those working class people, they drink that regular bourbon that and that's what they do. But then I always wondered, does that really sweet barrel. That, I mean, that made sense why barrel picks came into, you know, why they did it, because they had, what did you do with it before? You couldn't put it on the profile because it would throw it off. It's too much sugar,
Everything.
you know what I mean? And so it's you know, overall, I really think the maturation process and how people use it is just, as we keep talking, it's so unique to see all the different things that you actually can do on something. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk to you, well, not the last, but we got a couple more minutes, but another thing I wanted to ask you is about age.
Jeff says, "Fuck off, Alan. Get off my show. I'm done with your shit."
Holy shit.
No,
I can't
no,
believe you
you're
just said that.
don't you think that normally
What the
you're
hell?
pissed at me because I make you stay way too long? So like 3-4 hours go by and you're like, what the fuck are we still podcasting for?
No, because see, I've basically almost quit drinking at this point. So like for once, I'm like, oh, okay. Like, you know, normally I get done, I'm like, oh, how is that 3.5 hours of my life?
It just went by like that, right? Right now you're like, this guy needs to shut the fuck up.
No, not at all, man.
No, but
Not at all.
let's talk about age, okay? Because I really feel that in the industry, that's one of the reasons why I think used barrels. Now, you've been experimenting at French Lick with used barrels. I mean, with the Whiskey Witch. I mean, you had us taste it with the used barrel and in the new barrel. And it's like almost two different whiskeys, right? So, I mean, talk about one. Do you see the future of aging, especially with how things go, that instead of us selling all our used barrels off to Scotland and other things, that we start using them to make what would you say, a softer whiskey? It's not as, you know, it's not as harsh, and then we start aging things longer because, you know, we're Americans, and if you can age, you know, a bourbon for 50 years, we're gonna fucking want that, because nobody does that, and we always want what nobody's doing, you know. And is that going to be, you know, is that the next level? And then your stock, you know, what you just celebrated 10 years of distilling, correct? I mean, you
Legal distilling.
legal, yes. And so you've got stuff at French Lick that I believe is getting to be 8 years old, right?
Do? Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So what are you seeing as it matures like that? You know what I mean? I mean, is it making that whiskey better? I mean, even to the point where if you could get like a really good 8-year whiskey and then put it in a used barrel and age it another 6-7 more years in a used barrel, I mean, those are the kind of things that are open to you. You know what I mean? As you go about it. I mean, how does your aged whiskey seem different than your 4-year whiskey?
You put a lot of questions in there, Jeff.
Which one do you answer first?
Let me start with and you'll may have to remind me as we go. Let me start with what I see people doing with barrels thing and what my thoughts are on that. So I personally prefer used barrels. If it were up to me, and trust me, guys, if I ever go on this journey again in the craft distilling world, you will see a lot of products in used barrels. I prefer used barrels. We did a lot of that at Copper and Kings. I love doing that. I love what a used barrel does, and it doesn't necessarily soften. It actually allows the boldness of those raw materials to come through in a very different way that I really appreciate. Right? You know, again, just like commodity stuff, there's room for smooth, which is a word that I hate. You know, right. It's not a great descriptor, but there's a room for smooth and sweet, which is literally what a 3 and 4 char does over time. Smooth and sweet. It smooths out the edges, sweetens everything up. That's not me, man. What my ultimate goal is with a whiskey, where I'll be happy in this industry, is when I can put a whiskey in front of somebody that they can spend 20 minutes fucking nosing before they drink it. And then when they drink it, spend another 20 minutes drinking that first glass, trying to figure out what the hell is going on. And you don't get that from a new barrel. You get that from used barrels and certain types of maturation, certain types of distillation, certain types of yeast, and certain types of grains. That is my obsession. If it were 100% ever up to me, I'd never make another bourbon again in my life. I'd make American whiskey and go on about my happy day and be a happy fucking camper about it. I think the big guys they've already tied up the barrel market. And any craft distiller out there will tell you that. And if they haven't told you that, they're probably deluding themselves, because right now, if you want a good air seasoned stave barrel, you're going to pay over $600 a barrel for it. Listen, when I started at French Lick, I was buying the same barrel for $190. When I was at Copper and Kings 2 years before that, I was buying that same barrel for $140 10 years ago. We're up to $600+ now. That is not sustainable for small craft distilleries.
No way.
And as I've said about distilling size, you're going to be one of two things to survive the bubble that's coming. You're going to be great fucking big, and even then, there's no guarantee, because there's too many of them, and those foreign markets haven't opened, and they're going to eat each other. And I don't want to be a part of the market of bourbon when they start doing that, because it's going to be ugly. Or you're going to be really, really small. And if you're in the middle, you're dead unless you can innovate very, very, very quickly and get the new consumers and have them age out to where they'll actually buy your product the rest of their life. So I think that we're not going to have a choice on the craft side, but to really turn to used barrels. More importantly, and not to piss off any of my Cooper friends out there who I love very much, and please don't cut me off on barrels, guys. I'm just begging you right now, don't. In a couple years, you can tell me go fuck myself. It's fine. But for right now, I think what we need to see happen in the cooperage industry, because the cooperages all used to do this and they don't have time for it anymore because they're too busy, making barrels for the big guys. We need a cooper to come in that will rejuvenate barrels. You take a used barrel, once used barrel, you take it in, you take the head out, you shave an 1/8 inch off the inside, you rechar it. It's 90% of what a new oak barrel is, but it still has some of that beautiful character that those used oak barrels have. And what people don't realize about barrels is it's not a one use, second use, done. One time char, reuse it to finish with or to even mature with, take it in, have it shaved down, char it again, use it a third time, then a fourth time to finish in, and then use it as an almost neutral cooperage, as you were talking about, to take something from a new oak and then further age. As far as Spirits of French Lick and what's happening there with the barrels and as they age, there was certainly a big difference between 2-year-old Lee Sinclair and 4-year-old Lee Sinclair. To be quite honest with you, I love the 2-year-old Lee Sinclair. And in fact, people are asking to get that back. And I hope that representatives from my company watch this video and see this, because I'm going to say it in public so that hopefully they get some pressure put on them for it. It may make a comeback because people are asking for 2-year-old Lee Sinclair, which surprises the shit out of me, but they are, because they like that flavor profile. They still love the 4-year-old Lee Sinclair. I've got some 7-year-old Lee Sinclair that we can release as a single barrel series, which I think is what's going to happen with it. It'll go out as single barrels, not to accounts, but just out into the market as single barrels, kind of like, Evan Williams, single barrel, etc., that sort of thing.
That would be cool.
It will be cool. And there is a difference between it and the 4-year-old for sure. It's certainly a little rounder, a little smoother, a little sweeter, a little more coconut, a little bit more kind of a honey sort of thing going on with the oats that's happening in the barrel. I will tell you, I think if it's set in that barrel for another 2 years, it'd go south pretty quickly. I think our distillation protocols are set up such, and our maturation protocols are set up such that the prime age for most of our things on the high end for most of our bourbons is going to be 8 years. I think maybe the Solomon Scott Rye could potentially go 10, maybe even 12. But I think there's a certain time where it starts to nosedive for us pretty dramatically. I honestly think the real sweet spot for most of the things that we make is right in that 4 to 6 year range, depending on what it is. I can tell you, and I talked about this recently in a One Piece at a Time video, it's weird to watch our barrels, and I'm sure every distillery has this. All the ones I've talked to do, but I think for us, it's odd because we have no one to compare to, because we have the cellar type situation. Then we have barrel houses, which are like barrel barns. Barrels are only stacked 4 high, etc. So we're a little different than everybody else, but we notice these things that happen with maturation that are very weird, right? So I don't let people pick single barrels in the hot months of the year, and I don't let them pick them in the cold months of the year. In the cold months, they're restricted. All that bad stuff you don't want comes out of the char. It's in the barrel. Hot months, all the good stuff is pushed into the barrel, right? So that's one thing. But secondarily, what we've noticed is 4-year maturation, right? You come in, first 6 weeks, you pretty much got all the color that you're ever going to have out of that barrel. About 90% of it anyways. First year you come in, you taste it, and you go, still pretty grain forward, but it's softened up. It's got a lot of bread dough to it. Year 2, still got that bread dough sort of character to it, but it's started to balance out with the sweetness. It's almost confectionery. Year 3 in our distillery, everything tastes like fucking shit. Just gonna be honest with you.
It hasn't it's lost its early definition, and it's trying to get to its age definition. It's in between, so you're just not. Would you say it has no taste? More like it's neutral. Like you're not picking out bad shit, but you're not picking out good shit either.
Well, it's typically what's happening is it's stuck between in the middle of an esterification process. So one of the things that you'll see and I've seen these hit the market before, and some people really like them, and more power to them. But what you'll tend to see with those 3-year barrels across the board, whether it comes off a pot or a column, is this kind of banana Foster's note that comes across, but it comes off like artificial banana, and it just does nothing for me. At 4 years, I love our stuff. The rye, we put off for 5 years because everybody was releasing 2-year-old rye and 4-year-old bourbon. So we went the opposite. We did some 2-year bourbon, did some 5-year rye. That Solomon Scott, though, when it hits 6 years old, it tastes like trash for about 6 months. I don't know why. And then once it gets to 7, it's beautiful again. The Hindostan Falls is the same way. So but it is cool to be at the point where we can now make those analysis, going through the warehouse.
Okay. So you were saying based off what you think, but you're going to let some barrels go a little bit further, obviously. Do you think that you could get a surprise on let's just say a William Dalton goes 10 years and you get a surprise? Or do you think that, are you keeping yourself open for whiskey surprising you? Because isn't that what it always does?
Wouldn't say. I think you're giving us the credit for planning better than what we do, Jeff. I wouldn't say that I'm planning for any of that. What I would say is that we're small enough, and sometimes, if we pull down 30 barrels for a dump, we'll do 30 barrels of each product every 6 months generally for our dumps, right? We might find, if we find 2 or 3 that are off, we might make an iconoclast series out of that. If we find one that's way off, we might just put it back in the warehouse. Those barrels probably have a tendency to drift towards the back of that warehouse and sort of get forgotten about. So there may be some barrels at some point that it's just like, oh well, shit, we kind of forgot about this one back here. Now, there are some things. So we did the Lost River, which is a multi-grain whiskey. It's 7 or 8 grains. I can't remember how many, but we did 2 versions of that early on. We did the bourbon, which we haven't done for a couple of years, but we occasionally do some of that and put it back. And then we also did this huge project that was going to be a Solera project that we never got around to. And it was the same whiskey, distilled the same way, except that it was, instead of being soured with citric acid, it was soured with malolactic bacteria. And we left it at still proof. So it was at 135 proof. We put it into all used barrels, and I'm talking, you name a used barrel and it's in there. I've got rum barrels. I've got Copper and King's apple brandy barrels. I got Copper and King's grape brandy barrels. I've got bourbon barrels. I've got whiskey barrels. I've got wine barrels. And I probably got about, I don't know, first year there's probably 45 of those. The second year there's probably another 40 of them, plus a little new oak at high proof. Those are now, they'll be 8 years old in April. And I have no intention of touching them. Those will set for a long time. Just because, why not? We don't need the extra SKU right now in the system. We got plenty of cool stuff out there. And that one's going to be for the people that are truly into French lick, and maybe at 10 years old, that might be a nice anniversary release, and then hold back half of it and do it at 20 years.
Cool.
Yeah, and get it to sell like the iconoclast, $7,000-$8,000 a bottle MSRP, right?
All I need, truthfully, is I need to buy about 6 or 7 of those Lee Sinclair 7-year-olds I've got back there, and I need to get them out of Spirits of French Lick, start my own company, and then sell those for what Mike Drop sold my exact same whiskey that I did at Copper and Kings for, at fucking $1,200 a bottle, and I'd be a pretty happy camper.
It's crazy what's out there, and what I mean, as you know, there's not a whiskey on the planet that is worth sometimes the value as far as taste and creation. It's all about limited and how much you produce. If you're only going to produce 100 bottles of something, and it's been aging for a long time, and it's something that they're paying for the right to drink it. I mean, that's what you're paying for. But at the same time, you know, I'll never rip on it because it's the market that's there, and there's people with that kind of money that want to spend it on it. So, I mean, why the fuck not produce it? I mean,
I think you're 1,000,000% right there, Jeff. And I'll even say this as a little piece of humility that I've learned over the past couple of years, maybe. So I used to rip on that stuff, just like the column still stuff, a lot. I'm still going to a little bit, but I'm going to sort of elucidate on why that is. It has a place. It does exactly what it needs to do, exactly how it needs to do it. The only reason that I'm minded the way that I am about this stuff is because I'm probably a little precocious about being a distiller, and particularly because I tend to approach it from a more of a spiritual perspective. So in my mind, I always draw, there is a yes, but also, you know what I mean? But let's put it this way. I respect the yes a whole lot more than I used to, in terms of what it is, what it does, why it works that way, etc. So, yeah, maybe I'm getting soft. Maybe I need to go get a blood panel and check soft. My testosterone.
I mean, there's there's shipwrecks with champagne goes to the bottom of the ocean, sits there, they bring it up, and then they sell champagne from a ship that sank in 1897 with champagne, and people go nuts for that. But it could have been the shittiest champagne ever, because you know what I mean, at the time. But age and time preserved it, and they want to be able to taste something that nobody else can taste. I mean,
the other beauty of that, and I'll say this too. So one of the beauties of that is that is actually part of that spiritual aspect of this whole thing for me as well. And it's part of the spiritual aspect that these people are partaking in, even people that have money to do that. What they're really partaking in, and I've seen this with a couple of collectors recently, especially a collector that I've become friends with. What they're partaking in and they don't realize they're partaking in is the true alchemy of what that means. And what that means is it's not just old, right? And it's not just that it was old when it went into the bottle and it was old because it's in the bottle. The alchemy of what they're partaking in is this idea of, oh my God, there is still some representation related to agriculture and related to nature of how something used to be in a time period that I cannot imagine what it was like to live in.
Right.
This is not, and it's not just an alcohol thing. It's a yeast thing. This is what the yeast is like. If it's say a champagne or let's say an apple brandy, and you open that bottle from pre-prohibition and you smell that, you know what those apples on the tree the year that was distilled smelled like at the height of summer. There's something magical about that. That goes beyond any of the other conversations we've had, but that's the beautiful part of this industry that I do truly love.
Right. When you put your whiskey into the bottle and someone doesn't drink it, the energy and the surrounding everything of that time period is now frozen in that bottle. That's what it tasted like. When you distilled it, you aged it at this point in time, you're putting it in, and for the most part, it's being consumed right away. But if the bottles that stand the test of time and last for, then when someone opens it, they're basically opening what it was at that time. And we know we know for a fact what it was in 1970 wasn't what it was in 1950, wasn't what it was in during Prohibition, after pre-Prohibition. It's all different all the time. I mean, we're always the farmland changes as the soil changes. Some areas become more fertile, some areas go by the wayside. I mean, some of the grains that are in those bottles could be produced. So once again, in the bottle, you're talking about aging too, but you're not talking about aging quite the change of the spirit, but just the actual spirit ages, as you go. So,
yeah, exactly.
So now we're getting close to the last thing, but
Jesus, Jeffrey, I got stuff to do.
Yeah.
What are you doing?
No, oh, now I forgot what I was going to say. Okay, so now there is
You
a
know,
lesson.
what
There
you're
it goes.
talking about.
You want to know how dumb Hoosiers are? Did you notice I had to wear a shirt with my state on it? Because if I didn't, I'd forget where I came from.
No.
I inherited a bunch of old bottles from my dad that I didn't even realize, because I wasn't into bourbon and whiskey and all. And when he passed away back in '99, I literally, about 3 or 4 weeks after he passed away is when I got hold of them. I boxed all these up and I wrapped them up in towels and sheets and then boxed them up. And I put them up in the attic when I moved out. And had them out in my garage up until about 3 years ago. I told Jeff, and it's like, when we started this, it's like, oh my God, I've got all these old bottles of whiskey that my dad had. They're Jim Beam's, J.W. Dance, and Old Fitzgerald's, and I literally just pulled them out, about 3 years ago, and been opening them up, one by one. And
Absolutely.
And still just got several of them, but they're just so freaking good. When pull that cap off, and nothing like anything tastes like today.
Nope. And the focus wasn't all on the barrel on a lot of those, for sure.
Yeah.
Where did the cherry flavor that was on Beam? I mean, Beam does not have a cherry flavor like it did in the the early 70s. Anytime you do it, it's just like drinking, and it's not like drinking cherry cough medicine. It's got a really nice candy, almost like a candy cherry flavor to it. And it's just, when you get one of those, you're just like, and it's different from the other Dusties. They all have, Dusties always have that certain, what would you say?
You like those? Just wait till you taste these 68 and 69 JW Dance that I've been opening up. I had got about 6 of those.
Oh wow!
Well, now Nash, you're going to have to come to the barrel pick on the 8th and bring it with you.
Yeah, and oh my God, they are just fantastic. Every one of them's full, pristine in the box, and everything.
Wow.
So,
very cool.
Yeah, I need to bring up one of those.
Yeah. That cherry note's interesting. It's probably an esterification result, but also it could be the rye that was used at that time. And bear in mind as well that at that time Beam was certainly still making their own yeast on site. I can't verify or deny that they are or are not doing that now. I suspect they are not.
Well,
although it would be an isolated strain from what they had, but
so
there was.
They do liquid on site, because I talked to Sandy about it, and Beaming Suntory have pressured Freddie and Fred to change, and they won't.
Mm-hmm.
They have a refrigerator.
Yeah.
They've got the whole freaking thing. It's going, and they use the liquid yeast, and they don't change it.
Good.
All the Beam decanters that I got, and I had about 15 of those. They're all, and the ones that I have left that are unopened, they're all from like 70, 71, and 72. And I'm fixing to give Jeff one of those too.
Very cool.
I believe it's a 70.
Oh, let me throw in a couple other things here real quick, Jeff, and then you can ask your next question here. So a couple of the other things that excite me about maturation right now. So on the very small scale, bad motivator barrels and 1030 barrels. Like for you guys, if you guys were like, not encouraging home distilling, but if you guys wanted to finish barrels at home or make infinity barrels.
I do. So.
Yeah. That stuff, those things react just like 53-gallon barrels, but they come in an 850 milliliter format and a 2-gallon format, right? But they're not quick aging. They're not rapid aging. They're actually using higher quality oak than I can get at French Lick right now. So very worthwhile to have. They do some amazing things. That's going to help home distillers step their game up. And also, so I mentioned Stolen Wolf earlier. Eric has got a thing going with those guys where they drop ship a barrel And then Eric drop ships the white spirits, the white dog from his rye whiskey. You can buy enough rye whiskey to fill those things at home and have your own barrel of Stolen Wolf rye whiskey, which is pretty damn cool, I think.
That's pretty damn cool.
I'm also very interested in other types of oak. Garyana oak, Oregon oak is freaking phenomenal. I don't know if you guys have had anything with that yet. I've got a little bit of it I'm playing around with. I'm not going to touch on Amburana because I generally hate Amburana for the most part. It's too oily. It has its place, and there's cool stuff that you can do with it to tweak with it here and there. But for me, mostly a hard pass. I really like Missouri oak as well. It's really interesting. But so, running the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute on YouTube, I get a lot of questions from all over the world and things that I'm interested in. And what you'll see a lot in Eastern Europe is something that you don't see over here, a different way of maturation. So instead of using the barrel to really drive different flavors that are different from the existing flavors of the distillate that comes off, and bear in mind places like Romania, etc., they're making a lot of fruit brandies, a lot of apricot, a lot of plum, a lot of cherry and things like that. They tend to make their barrels out of things that will actually amplify the flavors of the raw distillate. So they'll make barrels out of applewood. They'll make barrels out of mulberry, Morris Alba. And it's entirely different than what you see here. And I think that's a pretty neat thing and a pretty cool innovation that, small craft distillers could play with as well. So,
well, I mean, one of the reasons why white oak is used, and especially in America, is because of the way that it doesn't leak. Correct? I mean, Greg, who's been on all night, he always talks about there's a certain chemical or part of the makeup of the wood that seals the barrel. Whereas some of the other oaks don't have it, and then you're dealing with leakage, especially some of the old, the old things. So I did remember. Well, you were talking about all the different. So here's what you take your white dog and you put it in a steel container. Okay, put it outside in a steel container and put a really tight screen so that you're whatever. How would the whiskey itself age just exposed to heat? And, it's just the steel is, that has no flavor. So what would the whiskey change through time? I know it's not going to change color. It's going to be white whiskey. Obvious. Well, would it get yellower?
So you're talking about in a barrel that would be open to the atmosphere, correct?
But a barrel, yes, a barrel but it also a steel barrel, not wood. So it's not.
Yeah, stainless steel. Yeah. So honestly, Jeff, that is exactly the proper process for making a true white spirit for drinking. Is either to let it air out for a little while, or even
oxidation.
Yep. Or even to heat it a little bit and drive some volatility off of it. You would be better to let that distillate run off the still a little faster and a little hotter and get rid of some of the vaporization there. Mm-hmm. Or to put it into a glass container with a cork that can breathe and let it set for a year or 2 years. So true, great world-class white spirits makers, although it's a white, quote unquote, fresh spirit, the ones who really take their art form very seriously, they're almost always aged at least 3 months to a year in either glass or stainless of some type, for exactly that reason.
And then put into a barrel?
Oh no, this is stuff distilled specifically for white spirit, sold specifically as white spirits.
So, okay, so
you're still getting the oxidization, you're still blowing off some of the volatility that you don't want, etc. Sometimes that comes with filtration. Sometimes it doesn't. It kind of depends on the tradition as much as anything. So,
okay, I was unaware. What do you call that? I mean, if you're
give you an example. So, in Drew Hanish's new book, he touches on this, and I pointed him in the direction of a few things on that book. But one thing we talked about with the Tennessee whiskey thing is, there used to be a classification of spirits that was every bit as big as what normal Lincoln County processed Tennessee whiskey was, but it was called Robertson County. The only difference is that Robertson County didn't rely on barrel. They only relied on charcoal filtration, and it's likely that early on Jack Daniels only relied on charcoal filtration, sold it as a white spirit. They were getting the same reaction that you would get out of a 3 or 4 char barrel. and that was common all over the place. I mean, here in Indiana, so we made, the apple brandy and the peach brandy that I've talked about a million times. What people don't realize is they did barrel that, and they did sell it mostly to people who were blending apple brandy and peach brandy from out of the Ohio Valley. But locally, they would have cisterns of white brandy that they would age for a year. And locally, all the way up until Prohibition, the preferred drink was straight up white apple brandy or white peach brandy, sometimes with a teaspoon of honey in it.
So that type of spirit
Yeah,
has really kind of gone by the wayside, even though it was popular. So you go to Scotland, you go to Ireland, you go to Canada, and they can age their spirits. They don't have to age them in new oak barrels. They have to age them in some cases. Just it can be used oak barrels, but even in Canada, it just has to be at least a used wood barrel. It could be anything. So is it Prohibition that basically shocked and cut the knees out of the spirits industry in America, where there's a ton of stuff that, like, even in Canada, I mean, they got the colder time, they're aging in older barrels. So you could find a Canadian whiskey in a used barrel that's 20 years old, and you put it into a bottle and you put it in your glass, and it's going to be a light colored whiskey. It's not going to have, you would think 20 years it would be dark, and same thing with Scotch and whatnot. But here in America, it's almost like we completely, that art doesn't even exist. I mean, it exists through Canadian whiskey, I guess, but most Americans, drinking Americans that are into certain things are like, they don't want anything to do with Canadian whiskey.
Well, because and what you're driving at here is very barrel specific. But what I would say about the United States and the history of distillation in the United States is that while, yes, there were aged, well-matured whiskeys on the market, and they did exist prior to industrialization, the vast majority of, going back to the blue-collar workers again, the guys that busted knuckles, etc., they had no interest in barrel age. That was not what they grew up with. That wasn't what the culture was throughout the United States in any way, shape, or form. And if charcoal accomplishes the same thing of mellowing, knocking the edges down, plus the distillers using a pot still, making good, tight cuts, and you drink it, does it taste good? It tastes good. It doesn't give you a hangover. It gets you where you need to be after the end of a long work day. That's what they were interested in.
Cheap,
right?
too. It's much cheaper. You didn't have to age it, so they could bring it to market,
Well,
right?
It may
to the worker.
maybe somewhat much cheaper, but think about this too. Bear in mind that most of those stills were going to be wood or coal fired. So at the very least, you got one dude that's constantly feeding the fire. You got somebody that's cutting all that wood. And let me tell you, it takes a lot of wood to run stills like that. A lot of wood. And it's not, you don't put big pieces in there. You got to split that shit into kindling sized pieces when you're running a still. Yeah. So imagine the cost there, plus you're making your own malt. And bear in mind that most of these guys were just running what they called common stills. So they were stills that did not have various bells and whistles on them. Some of them did, but most of them didn't. So in order to make that white whiskey, a lot of times, and they had different grades. You'd have basically 4 grades. First grade was literally single pass, rot gut, right out, stripping run off a pot still. Second grade was double pot distilled. Third grade, triple pot. Fourth grade, 4 times distilled plus charcoal filtered. So it wasn't even cheaper. It was just that's what the preferred drink
Whiskey
was.
Okay. So yeah, they didn't want something that's been toned down through a barrel and added stuff in. They wanted what they had, and they knew, okay. So it makes sense.
Yeah. It's a weird thing to talk about because we're just far enough out of reach of people in our lifetimes. And I know you guys are a little older than I am, but even in your lifetimes, you're just far enough out of reach that there was nobody that you could talk to that remembered that time period, right? And could tell you about that time period. And the books that you read about that time period are all written from now looking backwards, or at least the books that are commonly available. And it's always a mistake in history to look back on history. You have to start at the beginning and come forward, or it's very hard to get an understanding. And certainly the marketing departments of pretty much any distillery out there, including craft distilleries for the most part, would much rather look back as opposed to start from the beginning and come forward, because it makes their stories make a whole lot more sense, right? You learn more as you go, and then you go, well, shit, my story is bullshit, and now if I say anything, everyone's going to know.
Yeah, I mean, marketing, marketing also to Americans. I mean, we are such a romantic culture. That's what we want. We want the good story. I'm the first to admit it. I want the package. I want the story. I want the quality. I want the whole thing. I've said it to people. I don't give a shit if it's the best bourbon ever. If you're going to sell it at Costco, I don't want anything to fucking do with it, because it just goes against why I do this. I'm in this to enjoy myself, meet people, share times, make friends, and buying my whiskey at Costco is just like stripping everything that I'm in it from. And people will argue all the time. I'm just not in it to spend less. I want to actually, I want to spend a little more on it, because it makes me feel good that I have something that I spent some money on. It's like tennis shoes, right? It's like, is Nike, what was it?
You're talking to the dude wearing New Balances over here. Watch it, Jeffrey.
No, I mean, there's quality tennis shoes, but where you get into the money stuff, it's like, is the, $800 Nike special edition as a shoe any better than the $80 basketball shoe you actually play in? I mean, no, it's not. It's just, you want that one that makes you feel good. I mean, what was it? Stefan Marbury proved the point. He's like, I'll put that same shoe out and call it Starberry, and I'll charge you $32 for it, and I'll only charge you $12 for a hoodie. He went out of business. His shit was the same.
We're talking maturation here, so I'll mention this as well. So part of that maturation is me trying to mature a little bit as well. Not much, obviously, by my foul language, which will never change. On the back of my tombstone, when you walk past it and you're paying tribute to me when I die, it'll say you can still go fuck yourself. But nonetheless, one thing I will say, so just like having a little more respect for columns still and all that sort of stuff that I just talked about, and doesn't mean that I'm not going to make fun of those guys, because I'm totally going to fucking make fun of them, because it's what I do. But I would say this, I have figured out, and this is just a matter of me being a dumb Hoosier from the middle of nowhere, that I was so idealistic that, none of that shit made sense to me before. But if I could get a Costco contract, I'll make their cheap ass whiskey so I can go do the cool shit that I actually want to fucking do. That's fine.
Yes, you can make their cheap ass whiskey. Well, from everything that people say, it's not even that cheap ass whiskey. They just need a certain amount, But at the same time, like I said, I ain't buying it. I'll buy the stuff you're fucking around with, the stuff you want to do. I don't know,
man.
Hey,
you reckon Costco would put Alan Bishop's
buying.
name on a? Reckon Costco would put my name on their bottle? You think I could work that deal? I wonder how that'd look.
What? It would sure. You know what? There's no way you're doing that. I'm sorry.
I don't know.
If they actually put that down, you do know you'll be able to do the cool stuff, but you won't be able to. It'll be once you do that, it's kind of like you can't go back. I mean,
I know, but then the other side of that too is then you give me Costco money, and then I can just build come your own.
You can hire all the people to do the shit for you.
Yeah,
right?
Then I can just come home and build me a big fucking stupid pole barn like I want, and live in the middle of nowhere like the white trash that I am, and have a little craft distillery where I'm like, you know what, we're only open on Wednesdays every third week.
Every third week. There you go.
you know that Wednesday every third week wouldn't work. If you put your pole barn, well, put it this way, there's always.
Well, I'll be there. Nobody else will be.
Well, I don't know. You have a lot of friends. If you from your watching what you do at French Lick, it just seems like every day somebody shows up.
Right?
You have a draw. You wouldn't be able to. So this is how I look at you building a distillery like that. Okay, a little distillery there on your property. It's basically, if you build it, they will come. It's going to be a God thing, and you're not going to. At one point, you're just going to be like, all right, I guess I got to be open every day because all they do is line up every day to see me. You know, it'll be like a God complex kind of thing.
Yeah, like I said, I'm not like you come look at the stupid monkey dance. Go watch him.
You could build your new house in the back lot with glass walls, you know, so that they can just see you back there with, you know.
I mean, I'd see no reason not to, Jeff.
No, yeah.
That's right.
Oh, anyways. All right. So, I mean, then like, so summing it up with so has all the maturation type stuff throughout history already been done? Nothing new's happening? I mean, would you say we're just rediscovering, especially in the United States, they're just rediscovering how to do it? I mean, take it from one barrel, put it in a used, distill it, put it in a used barrel, put it in a new barrel, then take it in, put it in a slightly used barrel, and then call it American whiskey. I mean, has that kind of thing? I mean, what level will it stop? Or, I mean, how many times can you drain your barrel and put it in another barrel? I mean, you probably could go for a record, you know, like redistilling, Harlan Wheatley did it 113 times his vodka for that special bottle or whatever. You could put it in 113 different barrels.
You know, keep doing it as long as people are still buying it. What I would say is I think that I don't know. I mean, how much of it is really, I don't know that any of it is new. I don't know that any of it is necessarily quote unquote innovation. That what I would say is that there still remain and there's a number of distillers that know about these things out there, because I'm not the only dorky one out there, but there remain a number of old surveys and a number of old books. Great book by Irving Hirsch, as a matter of fact, for anybody that's curious, and I'm not going to tell you what all's in it. You can find it yourself. There remain some methods that people still aren't playing with, for sure. Methods for preloading whiskeys with wood flavors before they ever touch a barrel. They're touching staves, but they're touching staves at high temperature, touching staves with vortexing, things of that nature in particular. If you really want your whiskey to taste like it did before Prohibition alongside your maturation, I mean, there's a number of things I've talked about over the years that people can do with, you know, not doing completely efficient fermentations and things of that nature. But here's another great big one. Guess what, guys? They didn't used to have RO filters in distilleries, did they? They used to leave those minerals in the water when they proofed their whiskey down, didn't they? What do you think that does for the flavor? But you know, the only people that really play around with that are home distillers. Michael Stallings was the most brilliant person in the world when it came to that. So Mike had 2 springs on his property, and bear in mind that he was an alchemist too, and so he approached everything from a spiritual perspective. Depending on what he was making, 1 spring was limestone and 1 spring was sandstone. And depending on what he was making and what flavor he wanted out of it and what his intention and discernment was, he would proof his whiskey down with one or the other of the 2 spring waters to give it a particular flavor. So there's still stuff out there. It's not anything new. It's all been done before, but still things that are worthwhile.
Well, yeah, just like when we did the when we went out and came to your place for you know, the Alan Bishop experience. I took home that 1 jar that we had produced, and I proofed it down. Canton's water is huge in minerals, and it loosed like it was. I wanted to give it to some guys at work, some young kids. I didn't want to give them the full out proof, so I put it in, and it loosed like it was absinthe. It just turned cloudy almost right away, and you were just like, "Yeah, that's kind of how it works with some water, and you know, different temperatures, and you have to know what you're doing."
Funny that you should say that, is because with, you know, I've got a 430 feet deep well that I had drilled when the second year that I moved in here, and so that's the water that I use, and it's non-filtered. And the worst problem that I have is when I start mashing in, is I got to get that pH right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Once I get that pH right and I get mashed in, then I don't do any filtering when it comes out of that well. It's right straight out of that pump,
So
right into the barrel, the mash barrel, and then I get that pH right, and then I mash in. So,
Yep.
But it's it's been making some pretty damn good liquor. So,
Well, it's just like everything else in agriculture and distilling is agricultural, and people forget that. We moved so far away from what was, in my opinion, intended for us to be our kingdom and our domain, that sometimes it has very little resemblance to what it once was, and everything advances, obviously, but I think some shit got lost along the way and people are still picking that up.
But then the process that we like to do, and people accept older aged whiskey now. I mean, at one point in the 60s, they were just dumping it. It would, or even in Wild Turkey, if something got too aged, they didn't, that wasn't something that people were buying off the shelf, a 10-year Wild Turkey.
Well,
now
here's a funny thing about that too, Jeff. Something else that changed over the years. So because the market has gotten stupid to some degree and has gotten unwieldy, it used to be that there was a time, and the old timers would tell you this too. And when I say old timers, I say that respectfully. And what I mean to say is the guys that the previous generation of distillers at big distilleries, they would tell you, hey, sometimes you just get a shit barrel and it's just shit and it has to go back into a still. You know what happens now? There's no such thing as a shit barrel. You know where it goes? It goes on the fucking market to somebody buy it in bulk and blend it as a non-distiller producer. That's where it goes.
Yeah.
There are no shit barrels anymore. It doesn't happen.
Well, I mean,
unfortunate.
I mean, we had a craft distillery and they were producing some stuff and it wasn't very good. And they got the right marketing team and the right people with pallets in there, and they were able to disconcern the barrel. They knew the shit barrels, and they were bad enough that they had to be destroyed. It wasn't even good enough to sell to somebody else, but ownership wasn't happy with that. They were like, well, we've upped the quality of, and now that they've let those people go, it's kind of gone back to, you can tell they were, even if it's a shit barrel and you put it into the blend, that's going to affect your blend. It just is, and it's like, but from the people that you talk to, you knew that there were some barrels that they just had to get rid of, and it wasn't all of them, but they were using them all. Like you said, that's one thing that, there's no way that every single wood barrel that, piece of wood, and you age it and sometimes it goes wrong. They're not it's bad, not bad whiskey. It just has a flavor profile that's not right. And what you do with it.
That's one last note I'll make on maturation here before we wrap up, Jeff, and on Spirits of French Lick thus far. I'm not going to include Copper and Kings in this because they were not my decisions. I have not ever put anything out from Spirits of French Lick that I was not absolutely proud of. Now, I put some shit out that people didn't know what to do with, like Aquavit. It catches on, it drops off, catches on, drops off. I put out some weird versions of things, but it was still good whiskey, in my opinion. There was a Dalton dump not last year, year before last. That was from the farm. The wheat came from the farm, and it was a different variety of wheat. It had a heavier bran on it, and because it had a brand-like characteristic, like brand cereal. I loved it. Some people didn't like it, but I've never put anything out. Not a single barrel has gone into a dump, ever, not once, that I wasn't proud of in some way, shape, or form. So
that's what a craft, somebody like yourself, that's why a craft distillery is, they're great, especially run by families, similar to the Hubers and similar to, different places. When you have that pride, and it's their name, and the same thing with you. You have that pride with the Spirit of French Lick. And as a person who really takes distilling serious, you can't put shit out.
Because fucking people will eat my ass alive.
One time, yeah.
That's why I respect you as a distiller you are.
Thank you.
Everything that you do, and because of that reason right there.
Well,
always respected what you do and what you put out.
I appreciate that.
Well, and And I, initially there was some people that always whatever. I mean, honestly, you can't be insulted by somebody might not like an Indiana profile, because there's just no way you can. There's not one whiskey on the planet. I will tell you this, even the best Pappy Van Winkle ever made, it's caramel, whatever. There are whiskey drinkers that would just think that was shit. I mean, it's just the way it is. That's how people's palates work. It doesn't matter what it is. I'm not saying Pappy's all that, but what I'm saying is,
I was about to say,
but I'm saying
Pappy's
there's
not the
some people
standard
who
of
hate
whiskey.
sweet whiskey. I mean, they're just like, I don't like sweet whiskeys. There's some people that hate,
To me, it's not the standard whiskey. A lot of people think it might be, but it's not the standard of whiskey.
Well, and we're a lot of reviewers, I think, sometimes rub craft distillers the wrong way. So it's funny to me too, because I've been on panels and stuff, and I've done blinds, and I've said stuff that in a rude manner that I shouldn't have said because I didn't know what it was. Right.
Yeah.
But here's the other thing: there's a lot of reviewers out there that taste whiskey and they'll do it blind, and they're people that really don't know anything about. They know whether they like it or they don't like it. They know what they're tasting, what the flavor is. Is it good? Is it not good? Right? Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And that's fine. That's easy. That's exactly how a plant like Jim Beam should run. Yes, no, quality control, right? Yes, no, yes, no. But when you're tasting something different, and you get reviewers who don't understand the actual technical art of distillation, right? And then they come across a note they're unfamiliar with, but they don't know whether that's a fault or where it came from, etc. And then they immediately destroy the whiskey, and then that destroys it for other people that might have tried it otherwise because they're not educated. The other side of that's on distillers too, excuse me, because a distiller shouldn't get mad when somebody blinds their whiskey and says something about it. But that communication should be there if there's an actual technical fault, here's what the technical fault was. Get your shit straight and we'll come back, right?
Right.
Or I didn't like it because it was a certain flavor. Why does it have that flavor? And the distiller doesn't get offended. The distiller should go, it has that flavor because we did this process this way, this time for this product.
Yeah.
So that's where the rub from a lot of that shit comes from, right?
Yeah.
And I see it all the time. I've been on both sides of it. I've been the craft distiller that has heard people say that shit about my stuff, but then also I have made the mistake one time on a show, and I won't say what show it was or whose whiskey we were reviewing. It had a technical fault. It was a pretty substantial technical fault, and there were 2 or 3 other people that agreed with me. The problem is that distiller was watching, and me, and being the ass that I am sometimes, me and some friends made a joke about it, and the joke was, it would have pissed me off, and so that's a humbling moment for sure. Like when you have to have that conversation with somebody that you're friends with because it was their whiskey and you didn't realize it was their whiskey, and then you said some really shitty shit about it, even if it did have a technical fault.
Yeah.
That's a weird moment in life right there.
Well, yeah, as understanding. So if you do taste the technical fault and it's not good, but as a critic, which we all are a critic, I'm telling you, there's people who like that fucking technical fault for whatever fucking reason. They think that's what they love to drink. I mean, for God's sakes, a bunch of the bottom shelf whiskeys, which everybody who tastes whiskey, that whatever, those whiskeys are sold in mass quantities. That's why they're there, because they're $9. Those people are there for the trick. And they can't afford to pay $32 a day for a bottle of whiskey. And I understand the purpose of it. It's not always the best purpose, but at the same time, those people like it. It's just like, and then who's to say, the proof hounds, their taste buds are probably burnt off, and then they love the taste of proof because they actually can taste. And then when they taste an 80 proof whiskey, they just think it's water. But in reality, somebody just starting out is going, why is that so hot? It's just like, if you learn that you don't want to insult anybody. And if I'm going to say I don't like it, I might come up with what it tastes like to me, like old man's urine or whatever. But I'm going to sit there while next to the person who's loving it and say, love it all you want. That's what it tastes like to me, because it doesn't matter to anybody else but yourself, right?
Yeah, I agree.
We're
I
all our
agree.
own
Well, and
critics.
some of the faults get confusing too, because there's a long tradition, for example. This is probably a good wrapping up point, but there's a long tradition, for example, in certain European fruit spirits of having specifically Brettanomyces infections in the fermentation, and also vinegar infections, and having a little bit of VA in a distilled spirit. And to be truthful with you, some of those I really like. Now, if you put those in front of a technical judging panel in the United States, they're going to destroy it. But for the style it is, from the geographic region it's from, it's not a fault. So,
Okay. Yeah. There's no doubt.
Interesting, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that Greg Schneider just said, if you put crappy whiskey into a barrel, you're not going to correct the fault. It's going to still come out crappy. You could put
1,000,000%.
You can put average or good whiskey in, and it'll help it out, but you can't put wrong whiskey in.
I bet Greg would agree with this too. One of the other problems with modern day distillers is not only can you not put crappy whiskey in a barrel and get good product out, but you can put good whiskey in a bad barrel and get really bad shit out. Because unfortunately, one of the skills that isn't being really taught or passed on is how to judge a good barrel from a bad barrel when you get it in.
Yeah, and Greg's I can't wait, because his stuff he was talking today. They just bottled. He was buying barrels from the company, and now his distillate that he worked on with Bardstown Bourbon Company, Steve and Nick, Steve and Nick there. It was like having 3 master distillers make one whiskey. But what he put in is now it's his stuff in the chicken cock. It's no longer sourced or whatever.
Good. That's awesome.
And it's good.
Congratulations.
But he's next year or coming up soon. He was picking the staves off the shade side of for the trees in West Virginia. He would go down there and pick all the staves to make the barrel, so he had more of the rings into the barrel. And that comes out next year, and I guarantee you, based off of what he's been talking about,
how much Greg is into the barrel process and the maturation process. He's all the way into picking how tight the grain is on the wood and all that, and the trees that were harvested, and all the way down to the way the cutting of the staves and everything, and the picking of the staves. Once, and how long they're air dried. So yeah, can't wait for you to meet him. And he was so impressed with your history and knowledge, especially about Shinley and Seagrams and all that. Was what he mentioned earlier in the comments. But can't wait for you two guys to meet. And he's definitely said to us more than once that he definitely wants to meet up with you at some point or another.
Yeah, I'd love to. Absolutely.
And I don't see how. I mean, he lives in straight up Floyd's Knob. I mean, right there. You live. I mean, you guys are like 40 minutes away from each other.
Not even that. Maybe 20.
Yeah,
maybe
I mean,
20.
I've gone from your place to Amore many times to meet what up. So, anyways, all right. So, final thoughts.
I gotta pee. That's my final thought, dude. I gotta pee really bad.
All right. So let's finish this up right now.
I got a 5 o'clock leave time for Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Yeah.
Good times. Well, safe travels, man. Safe travels.
I sure will.
All right, everybody. Thanks, Alan. Thanks, Super Nash.
Thanks a lot, Alan.
Thanks, guys.
Very informative. Always great talking with you and seeing you, brother.
Yeah, enjoyed it, guys. Thank you guys very much.
All right.
All right, everybody. We're the Scotchy Bourbon Boys. Make sure you check out our website, www.scotchybourbonboys.com, and then also check us out on all the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, X, and then all the podcast formats. But make sure you like, listen, comment, and subscribe. Leave good feedback, too. That helps out. Remember, good bourbon, good whiskey equals good times and good friends. drink responsibly, don't drink and drive, and make sure you live your life dangerously.
Dangerously.
All right, little Steve-O's going to take us out.
Oh, show me the way to the next whiskey bar. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why. Show me the way to the next whiskey bar. Oh, don't ask why. Oh, don't ask why. For if we don't find the next whiskey bar, I tell you we must die. I tell you we must die. I tell you, I tell you, I tell you we must die.
All right, there we go. We're off. We're still on Facebook and YouTube, but you got to pee?
Yes, I have to pee super bad.
You should go.
Thanks everybody at Facebook for watching. Cheers, everybody.
Yep.
Yeah.
For
Thanks
sure.
for having me, guys.
Yeah, good to see you.
Hey, good to see you, brother.
Hopefully you can make the March 8th. So that's Friday. Yep. I got that set up. I don't know who's all coming or whatever, but we'll come down.
Planning to be there.
So right. So last quick question: the mezcal barrel. You bottled that yet?
Nope. What mezcal barrel?
What mezcal barrel?
I don't know.
Okay,
what he's talking
CT's
about.
barrel. Did you bottle CT's barrel yet?
CT doesn't have a barrel.
He wants that barrel.
He has an empty husk of what used to be a barrel.
Oh my God! Yeah. So in other words, how much in history on the angel share? I mean, how much of angel share isn't angel share? It's people just hitting the barrels. I mean, is it 80%? I mean, angel share makes sense, but aren't we all angels?
This mezcal barrel you keep talking about, I don't recall that.
It doesn't exist.
I do not. Like they say on the stint, I do not recall that.
Okay.
Yeah. Angel share is officially 110%.
Yep.
110%, really? I mean, that only makes sense when the more you do that, you go, it's like the angel share. Anyways, and then when people, I've been doing well with thieving. I call it Whiskey Thieving 101, and I just every single YouTube video, and it's like taken off. But it's taken off because most of the time it's people questioning me, how is this thieving? Then I get in about a 20 back and forth argument with them, and I'm people are like, that's a good way to make a following, by being an asshole. I'm like, yeah, except if you're not but if you're not an asshole, nobody says anything. They don't question it. And if you're like, okay, yeah, that's it, whatever, there's not another back and forth, but you got 20 back and forths, all of a sudden the next thing you know, a million people watching the video and way more followers who don't take you as an asshole. They don't read it. They just look at it.
You need to reach out to my buddy Wayne Herbert over at Ozark Steelworks. He's making little mini thieves. So you use them for like 15 barrels and bad mows and stuff like that. Reach out to him and have him make you one that says the asshole on it.
That would be.
I need to. What was that? Who was that?
Ozark Steelworks.
Ozark Steelworks.
Yeah,
make it the asshole.
I'm friends with
like I said
him on Facebook, because the guy I got a Whiskey Thief distilling won't go in my 5-gallon barrels.
Yep, these will go in them.
Yeah, it's too big, and the one I bought I was trying to make one out of copper tubing and all that, and then I went up to Whiskey Thief. I was like, whoa, hell, there's a little mini thief. I took it back and tried to stick it in my 5-gallon barrel. I thief it, and he's like, son of a bitch, it won't fit in the hole.
I think, Wayne, these are, and you can choose sizes as well, like as far as diameter and everything, but they're $4 or $5.
Copper?
Awesome.
Yep.
Yes.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you have him, stamp the asshole on it, he's going to charge you a little bit more, but.
Yeah.
I'm not buying Jeff one.
You don't have to buy.
I'm I'm gonna have Super Nash put on mine.
I swear to God, I just don't understand why you sit there and assume somebody who's doing this has dirty hands. It gets so it gets me so frustrated that they're just like, oh, his greasy, grimy, disgusting hands, and then the Roby drill you use from 1978. I mean, you are talking tool people. They're all over that drill. They're just like, that color of that drill that you guys use is an old drill. I mean, they're like, that's like 3 colors behind, and there's like half of them assume that you put drill bit grease oil on the drill bit, like because you're drilling diamonds and you need to put oil on that drill bit, and then it gets in the whiskey. Oh my God. And then it's like, do you like wood chips in your whiskey? Yeah, that's what whiskey is. It's basically wood particles. How do you think it turns brown?
Well, some people, the best parts of them just ended up as a brown spot on their mom and dad's fucking sheets that ran down their mom's ass. So
it's insane. They're so OCD that they can't handle. He touched it and put it back in. We've talked about this, but then you throw out the one. I think it's got 730,000 views. Yeah, I just wiped my ass after taking a shit, and I didn't wash my hands. That's what it comes off. And now half of them, everyone that goes, they're just laughing their ass off by the statement because they get it. I basically send an invitation to start watching the podcast. The other ones, they're like, what is he talking about? He doesn't watch. Like, you were serious. I mean, it's just like, and that's like hundreds of people. It's just so funny. And it's like, guys like, well, you just gotta stop being an asshole. I'm like, no, I don't, because when I wasn't an asshole, I didn't get anybody to watch my shit.
Yep. I feel you, man. I feel you.
It's just like, yeah, you could just sit there and have nothing happen and never sell a bottle of whiskey, right? You put a little edge on it, and you got to still be nice to the people who come across as nice or intelligent. But if you're just this dumb, and YouTube won't let me like just call them fucking idiots or anything, because they'll just give you a little thing at the top. Now be kind, it's a whole cultural thing that they keep up on you, but you can insult the living shit out of them actually calling them an idiot. You could get really creative, and it's actually what you got to agree. It's fun, right?
It is. I enjoy it.
I think it increases your intelligence as far as being as a writer, because then you think of more creative ways to actually write stuff when you do, because you've insulted people so many different ways without insulting them.
Yes. I'm gonna go piss now, guys.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, guys.
All right, man.
All right. Love y'all.
All right.
Later.
Yep. See you soon. Love you, man.
See you guys. All right, brother.
Are you leaving yet?
Yeah, I got like I said, I got a 5 o'clock.
All right, I'm gonna cut off Facebook. Thanks everybody on Facebook. There's Facebook gone.
Cheers, everybody. Appreciate everybody watching.
Let's see what we got on YouTube.
Great night.
We might have got something on YouTube tonight. Welcome to the chat. Nope, we didn't get anything on YouTube tonight.
What?
No. Let's see.